Hello and welcome to the POLSIS Research and Profile series. My name is Andrew Phillips and today it is a pleasure to speak to my colleague Prof Stephen Bell, who has just written his book Fair Share, Competing Claims and Australia's Economic Future. Greetings, Stephen.
Hi, Andrew.
So the book Fair Share, why this emphasis, right from the title, on the emphasis on fairness and equity? I thought growth was meant to be the be-all and end-all for economic policy.
Yeah, the basic argument of the book is that increasingly, and this has happened in the last probably 3 decades, Western capitalism is running into limits to growth. So every decade growth is going down. Increasingly we're realising that the key problem is inequality, particularly slack wages, which is leading to weak aggregate demand, which is driving weaker economic growth, and that seems to be a strong trend.
Right. I thought Australia was doing quite well, though, in comparison to other OECD countries.
Australia's doing really well. Australia's almost like another planet compared to Western capitalism in general. The main court cases, if you like, are Europe and the United States.
Okay.
And what's happening is that Australia looks in recent years, and even the last 3 years or so, to be following that sort of trend.
Okay. So you talk about in the book this sort of scary concept of secular stagnation. And I assume that from what you were saying, and this is a problem the United States and Europe are already experiencing. What does secular stagnation mean?
Basically what I just said, slower rates of economic growth decade by decade since the 60s, when the end of the post-war boom occurred. So the 70s, 80s, 90s and through, every decade we've had slower rates of economic growth in aggregate. This is particularly pronounced in the United States at the moment. And it's driven by the forces I've just mentioned. Inequality is a key driver.
Okay, and so if you're linking economic inequality with the threat or the reality of secular stagnation, you talk about in the book with your co-author, Dr. Michael Keating, the need to focus on an idea of inclusive growth. I was just wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about what you mean by inclusive growth.
Inclusive growth essentially means that growth is driven by incomes generated by the bulk of the population. Now, what's happening, and the problem essentially is that growth is being driven in the last 4 decades, if you like. We've used escape routes to escape the underlying problem of inequality and reduced aggregate demand, etc.
So what kind of escape routes?
Well, the first one in the 1970s was inflation. So we were spending money we didn't have, and we had wage price spirals, etc. So we're just inflating the economy artificially. That couldn't go on, and it was basically stopped in the 1980s. Since the 1980s, we've relied increasingly on debt and housing bubbles and asset price inflations, etc., etc. And that reached its high point in the crash of 2008. Okay.
And so now that you're arguing that these escape routes have been exhausted?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we're increasingly confronting the music in recognising, and the big economic think tanks and advisory, lots of economists have increasingly come on board with the idea that inequality is a key problem which we really can't escape easily, and that we need to confront. Now, what's happening in the United States under Trump in particular is it's still the recourse to debt. So tax cuts, the public budget goes further into debt, trying to artificially stimulate the economy.
Right.
That's a sugar hit. It can work for a couple of years. It's not the solution.
So you're not a Trump fan. I'm stunned to hear that.
I think the Trump economic policy won't work.
Fair enough. I'm just curious, obviously this book is a team effort. You were writing with Dr. Michael Keating, who was famously the former head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet under the Prime Ministership of Paul Keating. No relation, of course. I just really wanted to get a sense from you. What was it like collaborating with Dr. Michael Keating, and in particular, what were the advantages of collaborating with someone with such insight into the policy-making process?
Two advantages. One, he's a very good economist. He's published books and over 100 papers in economics journals, so he's a very serious economist, labour market economics. So it's good for a political scientist and a political economist, if you like, which is me, to team up with serious economists, and the interface between politics and economics is really useful, I think, as the book shows. The other one is that Mike had tons of experience in the Hawke and Keating governments, was a key player, probably one of the top 3 or 4 people in economic policy making in the 80s and 90s. And knows Canberra and the policy system and how politics, gets fed into economic policy.
So I'm assuming that gave you a bit of access that you may not have otherwise had in terms of interviewing former policy experts, or?
No, I think Mike was the only policy expert we knew.
Okay, well, he's a very impressive policy expert.
The book wasn't based on interviews; it was based on analysis of materials, etc. But yeah, Mike was around and knew what was going on in those days, and still does. He's heavily engaged still.
I found this to be quite a riveting book, which is rare given that I'm not particularly focused on international political economy issues myself. But the thing that I thought that was a real selling point of the book is that it's of great practical importance. And it's got a great degree of policy urgency. So I did have possibly a rather cheeky question, but if you had 5 minutes with the Australian Prime Minister, I'm not going to speculate in terms of who the Prime Minister of the day will be, but if you had 5 minutes with the Prime Minister, what would be the one policy innovation that you would want to sell to them on the basis of the analysis of this book?
Oh, it's basically to recognise. So the last 4 decades under neoliberalism, so-called, we've had a focus in economic policy on the supply side, which is getting markets and competitiveness and sectors of the economy working efficiently. That's the supply side stuff, right? We argue we've done supply side reforms, right? The neoliberal reforms have been useful, but they've been done. We're running into diminishing returns on that front. The key challenge now is the demand side, which is the things I've been talking about. This is stagnant wages, right? Low rates of consumption because people are basically not, there's just not much money in terms of aggregate demand to spur the economy on. The key issue to address is inequality. So low wages, labour market reforms to try and boost the power of wage earners, to redress the increasing profit share in the economy, to grow the wage share in the economy, and to the extent that works or doesn't work, we also need supplementary measures in terms of income support measures. We argue in the book that we need actually to increase taxation modestly in this country, to fund increased income supports, education and training, etc., all focused on workers and the demand side of the economy. It's crucial. Tax increases aren't popular, but we argue maybe 3% over a period of time increased tax to GDP ratio would fund the necessary measures and make a big difference in Australia. If we did that, we'd still end up with a tax ratio less than New Zealand's.
Okay.
We're a low tax, low spend country. We've got a bit of headroom there.
So we've got a little bit of scope for higher taxes.
A little bit, yep.
I think this is why we can understand why we analyse politics rather than necessarily engage in retail politics. But nevertheless, it's a terrific book and a great message to end on. Thank you so much, Stephen, and I heartily recommend the book.
Thanks, Andrew.